The air in the subterranean chambers of the county morgue was always a dead, sterile chill, scented faintly with formaldehyde and disinfectant. For Liam and Marcus, this was simply their office. For 3 years, they had clocked into the night shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., their routine a dull, comforting rhythm of processing, logging, and storing the deceased. They had heard the stories, of course the unsettling whispers from nurses, and the exaggerated tales of spectral activity that clung to every old morgue. But for Liam and Marcus, the dead were just bodies, heavy and quiet. Their biggest occupational hazard was boredom. On a Tuesday night, that normalcy fractured. Around 1 a.m., the transport gurney rolled in, bearing the night's final arrival. The accompanying paperwork was sparse and cryptic. Male, cause of death, undisclosed. Notes indicated he was a known figure tied to occult practices and was a convicted murderer, possibly connected to human sacrifice. Liam sighed, pulling on his gloves. "Well, that's just cheerful," he muttered, glancing at Marcus, who was already frowning down at the body. The deceased was thin, pale, and covered in fabric stains that were rust red and black, but it was the skin beneath the shroud that commanded attention. From the neck down, the body was a canvas of extraordinary, terrifying complexity. The tattoos were unlike anything they had ever seen. They were not illustrations or stylized art. They were dense, overlapping symbols etched in deep black ink that seemed to absorb the dim fluorescent light. They were more akin to inscriptions, jagged, ancient markings, swirling spirals and inverted geometries woven together with sharp, unrecognizable glyphs. The overall impact was one of profound malice. The symbols felt heavy, secretive, and undeniably dark. "What in God's name is all this?" Marcus whispered, tracing the outline of a serpent-like mark on the man's forearm with a gloved finger. "Looks like some intense ritual stuff," Liam replied, forcing his voice to remain professional. "Just another deceased person, Marcus. Let's get him logged." They worked quickly, documenting the body and the highly unusual markings, struggling to maintain their detached objectivity as the weight of the inscriptions pressed down on them. They felt less like they were handling a man and more like they were handling a cursed artifact. Once the body was placed in the cooling unit and the area sterilized, they retreated to their small, cramped break space in the hallway, 2 plastic chairs, a scratched metal table, and a lukewarm coffee maker. The clock read 3:45 a.m. "Imagine the stories that guy could tell," Marcus mused, lighting a cigarette, a habit strictly forbidden, but ignored during the lonely nights. "More like the evils he could summon," Liam corrected, staring at the closed metal door of the cold room. The silence of the morgue was absolute, but moments later, it was broken by something entirely new. A stench. It wasn't the metallic tang of blood or the medicinal vapor of the chemicals. This was a thick, visceral odor, pungent, greasy, and horrifyingly familiar. The scent of burning flesh, mixed with sulfur and ash. They both stared at each other, cigarettes forgotten. "Did something short out?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking. "That's not electrical," Liam said, heart pounding against his ribs. "That smells like a bonfire of meat." They grabbed their powerful flashlights and warily walked back toward the processing room. The smell was strongest near the gurneys. They checked the cooling units, the electrical outlets, and the disposal chute. Everything was silent, sealed, and cold. There was no smoke, no source, and no explanation. "It's gone," Marcus whispered, the adrenaline making his hands tremor. They returned to the hallway, but the atmosphere had shifted. The morgue no longer felt like a quiet workspace. It felt like a container holding its breath. The oppressive silence quickly gave way to the ominous. The wheeled gurneys, stacked neatly against the wall, began to move. Not violently, but slowly, scraping against the concrete floor, 1 inch, then another, as if an immense, invisible weight were pressing against them. Liam and Marcus froze, gripping the arms of their chairs. Then came the sound, a low, gasping sob, wet and ragged, echoing from the far end of the hallway where the body storage units began. It was the distinct sound of someone weeping in absolute cold despair. "It's the pipes," Liam desperately tried to rationalize, though the sound was too articulate, too human. "The pipes don't cry, Liam," Marcus hissed. They didn't dare move. They sat rigid, their shared terror a paralyzing blanket. The weeping continued, moving slightly closer, occasionally punctuated by a sound like knuckles rapping softly against the metal of the storage drawers. They knew exactly which deceased person was responsible for this intrusion. The black magic practitioner hadn't just died. He had opened a door, and they were trapped inside the room with whatever stepped through. The remainder of the night was an eternity of muted horrors, distant whispers that seemed to scrape their names out of the darkness, shadows flitting past the edge of their vision, and the constant, subtle movement of objects that should have been stationary. They huddled together until the first grey light of dawn sliced through the narrow window, signaling 7 a.m. They clocked out in silence, their usual banter replaced by a horrified stupor, escaping into the morning air. They had survived the shift, but they were wrong. The evil spirit had already marked them. The horror did not end when they left the morgue. It only changed location. Marcus returned to his small apartment. The moment he stepped inside, the oppressive cold of the morgue seemed to follow him. The first sign was subtle, a kitchen knife sliding off the magnetic strip and clattering onto the floor. Then, his television flickered on, showing only static, accompanied by a roaring sound that made his ears ache. Liam fared no better. At home, he heard distorted whispers coming from empty closets. His mirrors seemed to harbor dark, rippling shapes that vanished when he looked directly. By the next evening, they were both functionally catatonic. They called their supervisor, inventing an illness, but the truth was they were traumatized, barely able to speak coherently about the things they were seeing and hearing. The unseen presence was a constant torment, a pressure on their chest, a cold breath on their necks, and the sickening scent of burning flesh that now clung to their clothing and property. Their trauma was absolute. When their families finally intervened, bringing them to doctors, the professionals were baffled. They found no physical ailments, only severe psychological breakdown consistent with extreme, sudden PTSD. Sedatives did nothing. The nightmares, when they slept, were vivid rituals enacted in the cold of the morgue, culminating in the sight of the dark symbols glowing on their own skin. Weeks passed in a fog of fear and withdrawal. They were failing. It wasn't until Liam's worried sister, unable to accept the doctor's diagnosis, called upon Father Thomas, the elderly parish priest, that anything changed. Father Thomas arrived at Liam's bedside, looking at the hollowed-out expression in the young man's eyes, and immediately recognized a deeper spiritual malignancy. He spoke softly, urging them to tell him what happened. Slowly, painfully, they recounted the details. The 3 years of boring routine, the arrival of the body, the dark inscribed symbols that were more like ancient script, the smell of burning flesh, and the weeping gurneys. As they described the nature of the deceased, the black magic, the sacrifices, Father Thomas closed his eyes heavily. "You were exposed to a vessel," the priest stated, his voice grave. "The markings were protections and summoning invitations. When the man died, the evil he was trying to bind was loosed. By handling him, by being present in that space when the entity manifested and sought purchase, you were marked. It is not possessing you, but it is feeding on you, clinging to you, marking your homes as its territory." Father Thomas understood the terrible synchronicity of the events. Their routine, isolated workplace had become the nexus for an unbound horror. What followed was not a simple conversation, but a sustained process of exorcism and cleansing. The priest worked tirelessly, using holy water, oils, and prayers, focusing not on driving out a single demon, but on breaking the spiritual hooks the entity had planted through sheer exposure and terror. Slowly, agonizingly, things got better. The object stopped moving, the whispers faded into the background static of the world. The acrid smell of burning flesh eventually dissipated. Liam and Marcus emerged from their ordeal, blinking at the sunlight, shadows of their former selves. The evil spirit had been banished from their physical space, but the marking had left an indelible scar on their souls. They never returned to the morgue. They recovered enough to live and function, But the nightmares never left the maternal replays of the weeping gurney and the terrifying, silent glow of the black, malignant symbols. They remained haunted proof that some terrors are real, and some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed.